Daniel Vance kept his gaze lowered, his focus entirely on the spilled iodine he was quietly wiping off the pristine, polished linoleum of Chicago's most prestigious medical facility, the St. Jude Elite Trauma Center. At 34 years old, Daniel was the oldest rookie nurse on the floor. He had salt and pepper hair, a quiet demeanor, and oversized blue scrubs specifically chosen to hide the mosaic of shrapnel scars crisscrossing his shoulders and back. To the rest of the staff, Daniel was just the slow, silent new guy who never spoke up in meetings and always volunteered for the worst jobs. "Vance, are you deaf as well as completely incompetent?" The sharp nasal voice echoed across the marble-tiled nurses' station, slicing through the low hum of the ER. Daniel didn't flinch. He slowly stood up, dropping the soiled rags into a biohazard bin, and turned to face Dr. Julian Sterling. Dr. Sterling was the hospital's golden boy. He was 30 years old, drove a sports car that cost more than Daniel's life insurance policy, and possessed the kind of unearned arrogance that only came from generational wealth and a fast-tracked Ivy League education. Sterling had never seen a gunshot wound outside of a textbook, but he walked the halls like a god among mortals. "Yes, Dr. Sterling?" Daniel asked, his voice even and respectful. "Don't give me that blank look, Vance," Sterling sneered, crossing his arms so tightly his tailored white coat strained at the shoulders. "I specifically asked for Trauma Bay 3 to be prepped for my VIP consult. Yet I walk in there and the intubation tray is on the left side of the bed instead of the right, and you haven't even laid out the central line kit. Are you entirely incapable of following basic instructions, or do you just lack the mental capacity for emergency medicine?" A young, bright-eyed junior nurse named Sarah stepped forward, her face flushing red. "Dr. Sterling, that wasn't Daniel's fault. We had a sudden influx of walk-ins, and Brenda told him to clean up." "I don't recall asking you for excuses, Sarah," Sterling snapped, not even looking at her. He kept his piercing, disdainful gaze locked on Daniel. "I am speaking to the glorified bedpan cleaner." Brenda, the formidable nurse head who worshipped the ground the doctors walked on, hurried over, her face set in a deep scowl. "Is there a problem here, Dr. Sterling?" "The problem, Brenda, is your newest hire," Sterling sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples as if Daniel's mere existence was giving him a migraine. "I don't know what third-rate community clinic you dragged him out of, but he clearly doesn't belong at St. Jude. He's slow, he lacks initiative, and frankly, I don't trust him around my patients. Keep him on janitorial duty, or I'll have administration review his employment." Daniel stood perfectly still. Inside, a familiar ice-cold discipline held him steady. For 12 years, Daniel had operated in places that didn't exist on maps. He had performed blind chest thoracostomies in the pitch black of the Syrian desert, while mortar shells rained down, pulling men back from the brink of death with nothing but a headlamp and a prayer. He had held the lives of generals and Tier 1 operatives in his blood-soaked hands. But here, in the sterile, air-conditioned halls of St. Jude, he was just a punching bag. And that was exactly how he wanted it. A quiet life. No explosions, no blood, no lost brothers. "I apologize, Dr. Sterling," Daniel said smoothly, lowering his head just enough to appease the arrogant physician. "It was an oversight. I will correct the layout in Trauma Bay 3 immediately." Sterling let out a loud, mocking scoff. "See that you do. And wash your hands twice, Vance. You smell like cheap soap and failure." As Sterling spun on his heel and marched away, Brenda jabbed a finger into Daniel's chest. "One more strike, Vance. I mean it. Now get out of my sight and go restock the trauma carts. You're useless today." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel murmured, turning away. Sarah gave him a deeply sympathetic look, but Daniel just offered her a tiny, reassuring smile. He didn't care about their insults. His ego had been burned away a long time ago. He walked toward the supply closet, craving the silence of the sterile gauze boxes, when a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was the red phone. The heavy, vintage red landline mounted on the wall of the nurses' station was tied directly to the regional military and federal dispatch. In the 3 years Daniel had been back in the civilian world, it had never rung, not once. The shrill, piercing ring cut through the chatter of the ER like a knife. The nurses froze. Brenda stared at it, her mouth slightly open. Even Dr. Sterling paused at the end of the hallway, turning back with a look of utter confusion. Daniel's posture instantly changed. His slump in his shoulders vanished, his eyes darkened. Before Brenda could reach it, the heavy double doors of the ER blew open and a frantic state trooper ran in, covered in dust and trembling violently. "Clear the bays!" the trooper screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Massive collision on Interstate 90. An armored military transport convoy was hit. We have multiple criticals, active hemorrhaging and amputations. They're 5 minutes out and they are bleeding to death." The pristine, controlled environment of St. Jude Elite Trauma Center evaporated in an instant. The polished marble floors and hushed country club whispers were instantly replaced by the shrill wail of approaching sirens, multiplying by the second until they shook the reinforced glass of the ER doors. "All right, listen up." Dr. Julian Sterling clapped his hands loudly, stepping into the center of the room. He puffed out his chest, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a high-profile crisis. This was his moment. "I want full trauma teams in bays 1 through 4. Brenda, page surgery, get the ORs prepped. Sarah, get the portable ultrasound and standard IV kits ready. And someone get Vance out of the way. I want him running blood from the bank, nothing else. Do not let him near the beds." Daniel Vance didn't argue. He seamlessly faded against the back wall, his face an unreadable mask, but beneath his oversized blue scrubs, his muscles coiled like a tightly wound spring. His eyes, previously dull and submissive, were now razor-sharp, calculating distances, assessing sight lines, and tracking the incoming chaos. The double doors smashed open. The pristine ER was immediately invaded by the smell of diesel fuel, charred Kevlar, and copper. Paramedics and dust-covered soldiers sprinted into the room, pushing 3 blood-streaked gurneys. The noise was deafening, shouts of military personnel mixing with the panicked cries of the civilian nurses. "Bay 1, Sterling barked, pointing grandly. "Bring the worst one to me." A towering, muscular soldier in shredded tactical gear was shoved into the bay. His tactical vest was violently torn open, revealing massive blunt force crush trauma to his left side and a mangled leg bound by a hastily applied slipping civilian tourniquet. He was gasping for air, his skin the color of wet ash. "Captain's down!" yelled a young, frantic corporal running alongside the gurney, his own face smeared with soot. "The transport rolled down a 30-foot embankment. He took the brunt of the heavy plating. He's bleeding out." "Back up, soldier. Let the real doctors work," Sterling snapped, shoving the corporal aside with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "Sarah, get a 20-gauge IV started. I need a complete metabolic panel and get him ready for a CT scan right now. We need to image that crushed leg before I even think about amputating." Standing by the supply carts, holding a stack of sterile towels, Daniel's eyes narrowed. "A CT scan?" he thought, his jaw clenching. "The man is in decompensated hypovolemic shock. If you put him in a scanner, he'll be dead before the machine spins up." "Doctor!" Sarah cried out, her hands shaking as she struggled to find a vein in the captain's collapsing circulatory system. "His systolic blood pressure is dropping fast, 70/40. Heart rate is 145. I can't get this line in." "Try harder," Sterling yelled, his voice pitching up a frantic octave. His confident facade was already cracking under the brutal reality of battlefield trauma. He stared at the captain's mangled leg, completely fixated on the visible, gruesome injury. "Get me the ultrasound. We need to find the bleeder. Where is that CT tech?" From his vantage point, Daniel wasn't looking at the leg. His eyes were locked on the captain's chest and neck. He saw the rapid, shallow, asymmetrical breathing. He saw the jugular veins distending like thick blue ropes against the soldier's pale throat. And most critically, he saw the subtle, undeniable shift of the trachea pulling to the right. Tension pneumothorax, Daniel realized instantly. The impact had ruptured the captain's lung. Air was filling the chest cavity, crushing his heart and choking off the blood supply. The leg was a distraction. The chest was the killer. "Dr. Sterling," Daniel said, taking a half-step forward, his voice low but carrying clearly through the noise. "Sir, look at his neck. Tracheal deviation. He has a tension pneumo. He needs immediate decompression, not a CT scan." Sterling whipped around, his face purple with rage. "Did I ask you to speak, you insubordinate janitor? I am the attending physician. You are a floor nurse. Look at the leg. He's bleeding out." "The leg tourniquet is loose, but it's not the primary threat. His heart is being compressed. He has less than 2 minutes." "Get out," Sterling screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the ER doors. "Brenda, call security and have Vance removed from this hospital immediately. I am saving this man's life." Suddenly,
The heart monitor beside the bed let out a piercing, continuous tone. Beep. "He's crashing!" Sarah screamed, stepping back in horror. "He's going into cardiac arrest!" Sterling froze. The golden boy of St. Jude stood paralyzed, his eyes wide with sudden suffocating panic, staring blankly at the flatlining monitor as the young corporal screamed for his captain. Daniel Vance dropped the sterile towels. The quiet, submissive rookie was gone.
The continuous, piercing shriek of the heart monitor was a sound that paralyzed the civilian staff of St. Jude Elite Trauma Center. For Dr. Julian Sterling, it was the sound of his golden reputation shattering. He stood rooted to the floor, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, staring at the flat red line dancing across the screen. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," Sterling finally stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "Get the crash cart. We need to shock him." "You don't shock pulseless electrical activity caused by obstructive shock," a voice cut through the panic. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Daniel Vance didn't walk. He moved with the predatory, liquid grace of a man who had spent a decade navigating darkened corridors under heavy fire. The slouch was gone. The submissive, quiet floor nurse had vanished entirely. In his place stood a cold, calculating elite operative. Daniel closed the distance to the bed in 2 massive strides. Without a word, he planted his hand firmly on the center of Dr. Sterling's tailored white coat and shoved him backward. The force was precise but undeniable, sending the arrogant attending physician stumbling into a tray of surgical instruments with a loud crash. "Hey!" Sterling shrieked, his face turning an apoplectic shade of purple as he scrambled to right himself. "You lay your hands on me again, Vance, and I'll have you—" "Quiet!" Daniel snapped. It was a command voice, forged in the fires of Ramadi and Kabul, a tone that made generals pause and soldiers instantly obey. Even Sterling flinched, snapping his mouth shut in sheer shock. Daniel turned his laser focus entirely on the dying captain. "Sarah, I need a 14-gauge angiocath, now. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." Sarah stood frozen, her eyes darting frantically between the furious Dr. Sterling and the terrifyingly calm floor nurse. "Daniel, I can't. He's the attending. You're not authorized." "Sarah, he has 30 seconds before his brain dies. Hand me the needle, now." The sheer gravity of his command broke her paralysis. Sarah tore open a trauma drawer, her hands shaking violently, and slapped the large-bore needle into Daniel's waiting, gloved hand. Daniel didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for betadine or a sterile drape. He found the anatomical landmarks on the captain's right chest by pure muscle memory. With a sharp, practiced thrust, he plunged the thick needle directly into the captain's chest cavity. Sssss. A loud, distinct rush of trapped air escaped from the catheter, releasing the catastrophic pressure that had been crushing the captain's heart. Almost instantly, the shrill, flatlining tone on the monitor stuttered, broke, and then miraculously morphed into a rapid, thumping rhythm. "The heart rate is back," Sarah gasped, her tears springing to her eyes as she stared at the screen. "The pressure is coming up, 90/60. "Don't celebrate yet. Triage isn't over," Daniel said with his voice completely devoid of emotion. He was already moving. He reached down to the captain's mangled leg. "The civilian tourniquet is slipping. It's too narrow, and it wasn't cranked tight enough to occlude arterial flow." Daniel reached down to the wounded soldier's shredded tactical rig. With practiced efficiency, he ripped a military-grade cat tourniquet from the webbing, something Dr. Sterling hadn't even noticed. He wrapped it high and tight around the captain's thigh, viciously cranking the windlass until the bright arterial spurting stopped completely. He locked it into place with a sharp click. "Roll him, 15 degrees, support the C-spine," Daniel ordered the soot-covered corporal, who immediately obeyed, recognizing the authoritative cadence of a senior non-commissioned officer. Daniel ran his hands over the back of the captain's ribcage. "Exit wound, right latissimus. He has a sucking chest wound." Daniel reached for a plastic supply wrapper, discarding standard protocol. "I need a vented chest seal, but this will do for an occlusive dressing. Tape it down on 3 sides to create a flutter valve." The ER was dead silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the stabilized heart monitor.
The nurses, the paramedics, even the frantic corporal simply stared in awe at the incompetent rookie who had just flawlessly executed advanced battlefield trauma care under 60 seconds. Then the spell broke. "What in the hell do you think you were doing?" Dr. Sterling roared, recovering from his shock. He marched forward, his face contorted with sheer, unadulterated rage. "You just assaulted a superior. You performed an unauthorized, highly invasive surgical procedure. You have no medical license for this." Brenda, the head nurse, was already lunging for the wall phone. "Security! I need security in Trauma Bay 1 right now. We have a rogue staff member attacking a doctor." Daniel slowly stood up from the bed. He wiped a smear of the captain's blood from his cheek with the back of his wrist. He didn't look at Brenda, and he certainly didn't look like he cared about losing his job. He turned his chilling, dead-eyed gaze onto Dr. Sterling. The heavy double doors of the ER swung open again, and 3 large, heavily armed hospital security guards rushed into the bay, their hands resting cautiously on their batons. "Get him out of here!" Sterling screamed, pointing a trembling finger right at Daniel's face. "Arrest him!"
The 3 hospital security guards advanced, their heavy black boots squeaking ominously against the polished, blood-slicked linoleum. The lead guard, a burly former cop named Miller, unspooled his radio and unclipped his heavy baton, his eyes darting nervously toward the chaos. "Step away from the patient, Vance," Miller ordered, his voice echoing over the frantic beeping of the stabilized heart monitor. "Hands where we can see him. Dr. Sterling gave an order." Daniel Vance didn't raise his hands. He didn't take a single step back. Instead, he leaned over the unconscious captain, his bloodied fingers pressing firmly into the soldier's carotid artery to monitor the thready, fragile pulse he had just miraculously restored. "If I step away, his airway compromises," Daniel stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded the room. "The decompression bought him time, but he has maxillofacial trauma. He needs a definitive airway now." "You do not dictate medical care in my ER," Dr. Julian Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking an embarrassing octave as he hid safely behind the wall of security guards. His tailored white coat was now wrinkled, his ego bruised beyond repair. "Grab him! Get this lunatic out of here before he kills my patient!" Miller reached forward, extending a massive hand to grab Daniel's shoulder and yank him away from the trauma bed. Quick as a striking viper, Daniel shifted his weight. He didn't throw a punch. He simply executed a localized, flawless tactical deflection. He caught Miller's wrist, applied a precise, agonizing pressure to the radial nerve, and twisted just enough to send the 250-pound guard stumbling backward in sheer shock. Miller hit the supply card with a loud clatter, dropping his baton. "Do not touch me," Daniel warned. His eyes, previously dull and lifeless, now burned with the cold, hyperlethal intensity of a Tier 1 operative. "Your asset is bleeding out internally from a blunt force hepatic laceration. The chest is stabilized, but his abdomen is distending rapidly. Look at the periumbilical bruising, Cullen sign. He doesn't need a holding cell, and he doesn't need a CT scan. He needs massive transfusion protocol, O-negative blood pushed manually, and an immediate exploratory laparotomy. He needs imaging," Sterling counted wildly, his face flushed red, emboldened by the colonel's presence. "Security, drag him out, now. Sarah, prepare the bed for immediate transport to radiology." Suddenly, the captain's body convulsed violently on the gurney. A horrifying, wet, gurgling sound erupted from the soldier's throat. The heart monitor began to wail anew, a different, terrifying alarm. The captain's jaw locked shut, his chest heaving as he struggled against an invisible barricade. "Oh my God, he's aspirating! He's choking on his own blood!" Sarah screamed, dropping a bag of saline. Sterling froze completely, the color draining from his face. Colonel Hastings shouted for someone to do something. The 2 remaining security guards lunged forward to tackle Daniel to the ground. Daniel knew he had less than 10 seconds to secure the airway, or the captain would drown in front of them all. He had no choice left. He had to cross the line. The 2 remaining security guards lunged at Daniel, their heavy hands reaching out to physically drag him away from the dying captain. They expected the middle-aged, unassuming nurse to crumple under their combined weight. They were catastrophically mistaken. Daniel didn't panic. He didn't even raise his pulse. As the first guard grabbed his shoulder, Daniel pivoted on his heel, using the man's own forward momentum against him. He trapped the guard's arm, applied a brutal, locking torsion to the elbow joint, and swept his leg. The guard slammed face first into the linoleum with a sickening thud, instantly incapacitated. The second guard, eyes wide with sudden terror, swung his heavy baton. Daniel's left hand shot out like a piston, catching the man's wrist mid-swing with a grip like a titanium vise. He squeezed, digging his thumb into a cluster of nerves. The guard gasped in agony, the baton clattering harmlessly to the floor, before Daniel shoved him backward with enough force to send him crashing into a supply cabinet. It took exactly 4 seconds. The room stared in stunned, breathless silence. Daniel didn't spare the guards a second glance. He immediately spun back to the gurney. The captain's face was now a horrifying shade of violent blue. He was locked in a severe trismus, his jaw completely clenched shut as he aspirated on his own blood. "Sarah, number 10 scalpel and a 6.0 endotracheal tube, now," Daniel roared, extending his hand. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, but recognizing the absolute authority of a master at work, bypassed Dr. Sterling entirely. She slapped the scalpel into Daniel's palm. "Vance, if you make that cut, I will personally see you sent to federal prison for murder," Dr. Julian Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking wildly as he hid behind Colonel Hastings. "You are a floor nurse. You cannot perform a surgical airway." "He's already dead if I don't," Daniel replied, his voice a block of ice. He didn't hesitate. His fingers palpated the captain's neck, instantly finding the cricothyroid membrane by pure, battle-tested muscle memory. With a fluid, unflinching motion, Daniel made a precise vertical incision through the skin, followed by a horizontal plunge through the membrane. A rush of trapped, bloody air hissed from the opening. Daniel seamlessly slid the endotracheal tube into the incision, inflating the cuff to secure it. "Attach the bag and squeeze," Daniel ordered Sarah, passing her the resuscitator bag. Sarah squeezed. The captain's chest rose in a perfect symmetrical heave. The horrific gurgling stopped. Within seconds, the shrill, erratic beeping of the oxygen monitor steadied, and the numbers began to rapidly climb. The cyanosis faded from the soldier's face, replaced by the pale but stable hue of life. Daniel had just performed a flawless, blind surgical cricothyrotomy in under 30 seconds under extreme duress, saving the man's life while entirely bypassing the paralyzed, panicking attending physician. But as Daniel stepped back to let Sarah ventilate the patient, the room remained dead silent for a completely different reason. During the brief explosive scuffle with the security guards, the flimsy, oversized fabric of Daniel's hospital scrubs had been violently torn. The V-neck was ripped entirely open down to his left bicep. Dr. Sterling, still trembling with rage, opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the words died in his throat. Exposed beneath the cheap blue cotton was a horrific, mesmerizing tapestry of survival. Thick, silver keloid scars crisscrossed Daniel's chest and shoulder, the unmistakable, jagged signatures of high-explosive shrapnel and close-range gunshot wounds. But it was the ink over his heart that made Lieutenant Colonel Hastings suddenly stop breathing. There, stamped onto Daniel's scarred pectoral muscle, was a faded but perfectly detailed tattoo. It was a winged dagger, piercing an emerald, engulfed in flames, overlaid with a medical caduceus. Surrounding it was the unmistakable, highly classified gold-bordered triangle of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Beneath the legendary unit insignia, etched in stark Gothic lettering, was a single call sign block: Archangel 2-1. Colonel Hastings' face drained of all color. His arrogant, bureaucratic scowl vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated awe and creeping terror. He took a shaky step forward, his eyes locked on the tattoo. Every high-ranking officer in the Pentagon knew the ghost stories of Archangel 2-1, the legendary Tier 1 JSOC medic who had walked into the jaws of hell in Fallujah and Helmand, single-handedly dragging dozens of operators out of impossible firefights before vanishing into civilian life. My God,
Hastings whispered. The sound barely escaped his lips. Before Hastings could speak another word, the entire hospital building began to violently vibrate. The low, heavy thwack, thwack, thwack of massive helicopter rotors shook the reinforced glass of the ER doors. But this wasn't the high-pitched whine of a civilian life flight chopper. This was the deep, thunderous, unmistakable acoustic signature of a heavily armored MH-60 Blackhawk setting down directly on the hospital's front helipad. The heavy double doors of the trauma center began to rattle on their hinges.
The reinforced glass doors of the ER were violently shoved apart by two towering operators in unmarked tactical gear and panoramic night vision goggles. They secured the entrance in total silence, their mere presence sucking the air from the room. Behind them strode a man who commanded the very atmosphere. He wore a crisp Class A uniform, his shoulders heavy with the 3 silver stars of a lieutenant general. This was Lieutenant General Thomas Holden, commander of Joint Special Operations. Dr. Julian Sterling, sensing the ultimate authority figure and desperate to save his own evaporating career, shoved past the frozen Colonel Hastings. He practically sprinted toward the general, frantically smoothing his rumpled white coat. "General! General, thank God you're here!" Sterling gasped, his voice oozing with a sickening mix of panic and sycophancy. "I am Dr. Julian Sterling, the chief attending physician. We have a catastrophic situation. I've been trying to save your captain's life, but we were just violently attacked by a rogue, insubordinate floor nurse. He assaulted security, he assaulted me, and he illegally cut into your man's throat. I demand he be arrested by your men immediately." General Holden didn't even blink. He didn't slow his stride. He simply walked right past Dr. Sterling, as if the arrogant physician were nothing more than a minor stain on the floor tiles. "General, Sterling stammered, his outstretched hand hanging awkwardly in the air. "Shut your mouth, doctor," one of the towering operators growled, stepping into Sterling's path and forcing the doctor to stumble backward in sheer terror. General Holden stopped at the foot of the gurney. He looked at the mangled leg, perfectly secured by the military-grade tourniquet. He looked at the vented chest seal. Finally, he looked at the flawless, life-saving surgical airway. Then the general slowly lifted his gaze. He bypassed the weeping Sarah, ignored the terrified security guards, and locked eyes with the man standing quietly on the other side of the bed. Daniel Vance was covered in the captain's blood. His cheap blue scrubs were torn open, the legendary Delta Force tattoo and the map of horrific scars laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked exhausted, but his posture was suddenly ramrod straight. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the St. Jude ER was the steady, strong beeping of the captain's heart monitor. General Holden's stone-cold expression finally broke. A look of profound, overwhelming reverence washed over the 3-star general's face. He snapped his boots together. With a crisp, sharp motion that echoed through the silent room, Lieutenant General Holden threw a flawless salute. "Master Sergeant Vance," the general boomed, thick with emotion and absolute respect. "It is an honor to finally meet you in the flesh, Archangel 2-1. They told me you were a ghost, but I see the savior of the Karengal Valley is still pulling my men back from the gates of hell." The 2 elite operators standing guard instantly snapped to attention, saluting the torn, blood-soaked floor nurse with a synchronized precision that sent shivers down the spines of every civilian in the room. Dr. Julian Sterling's knees literally buckled. He grabbed the edge of a supply cart to keep from collapsing, his face completely devoid of blood. The incompetent janitor he had been belittling, mocking, and trying to fire all morning was a legendary Tier 1 Delta Force operator. Colonel Hastings, who had threatened to throw Daniel in a federal holding cell, looked as though he was going to vomit. He hastily snapped a salute of his own, his hand trembling violently against his brow. "General?" replied Daniel calmly, returning the salute with a slow, heavy exhaustion. "The captain had a tension pneumothorax and was aspirating. He stabilized for transport, but he needs an immediate laparotomy for internal bleeding. Your medics need to take him now." "Consider it done, Master Sergeant," General Holden said softly. He finally turned his imposing gaze onto Dr. Sterling, who visibly shrank backward.
Dr. Sterling, my chief medical officer will be reviewing the security footage of this ER. If I find out that your incompetence jeopardized my captain and that you interfered with a decorated American hero saving his life, I will personally ensure you never practice medicine in this country again." Sterling opened his mouth, but only a small, pathetic squeak escaped his throat. He was utterly destroyed. Brenda, the cruel head nurse, stared at the floor, too terrified to even breathe. As the military medics swarmed the bay and seamlessly took over the captain's care, rolling him toward the waiting Blackhawk, the deafening roar of the helicopter slowly faded into the distance. The St. Jude Elite Trauma Center was left in a state of absolute stunned paralysis. The arrogant doctors and cruel staff could only stare in humiliated silence. Daniel Vance calmly walked over to the supply closet. He grabbed a fresh, oversized blue scrub top, pulled it over his shoulders to hide the scars and the legends, and picked up a mop. "Sarah," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence. "Yes, Daniel? Trauma Bay 3 still needs its floors cleaned," he said with a gentle, unassuming smile. "Let's get back to work."